Jeff, our episode has been taking a journey through the music of Trek, and like some of our past episodes, we like to do it in the chronological timeline of Star Trek. So we started with Enterprise, and that has now led us to Discovery, because that's next in line before the original series, and we'll keep going down until we get to Star Trek Picard. Of course, for you, it's the opposite, right? You have to come into Star Trek with a prequel to the original series, but also having decades worth of music that came before Discovery, and the challenge of it being a modern television series that's supposed to take place before the events of the show that aired in the 60s. So how did that all fit into your initial concept coming up with the music of Discovery?
Where the show placed in the timeline didn't really have much of an impact on what I was trying to what I would be trying to get across musically in the series. It was really more about how was I going to tie us to the iconic legacy of the sound of music of Star Trek while still trying to have its own identity. And I thought it would be important to stay connected to the legacy and yet also try to be our own show and try to have its own musical identity is probably a little too strong, but it have its own musical place in the canon, in the musical canon, so it where it sort of stands in the timeline is not really relevant, and we're not even in that timeline anymore. Right. Now we're way after, so now we're at the other end of the thing. So we're now before it, now we're way past it. So it's sort of interesting that I think that the most important thing that I think decision I could make, not knowing that was going to happen, was not trying to do something that would make it where we are in the timeline relevant, because little did I know at the beginning of season 1 that in season 3 we would be 1,000 years on the other side of that.
Yeah.
I'm sort of glad that I didn't really take that into consideration.
Well, it's kind of a good thing too, right? Because if you look, not any knock on Alexander Courage or the work he did, because it's very unique in its own way, but that music was so unique for its time that I don't feel like anybody could really replicate that today.
I'm not even sure that it would fit today. From a thematic standpoint and from a melodic standpoint, it's very important to me because I utilize a lot of that stuff. I can utilize his iconic fanfare. All I need to do is 4 notes and you're there. You're right there. You're taken right to Trek World. And that has proven to be very effective for me. But yeah, the way those scores sounded, the way they were orchestrated, the way they were sort of arranged and stuff, that was very much a time and a place that worked. And it all changed, again, with the movies changed a lot of how that was looked at. And then, of course, The Next Generation, which was my entry point into the world of Star Trek, was The Next Generation. The music for The Next Generation after the second and third season, when it became sort of more of what many of those composers refer to as just wallpaper, where the music became not as important and composers were doing the best that they could to make musical out of something that the producers were saying they wanted it to be less musical. They wanted it to be more about, the sound of it as opposed to the melodies and motifs and stuff. So, we've sort of come full circle, I think, in that way where we have made. Now, I think I do sort of a mix of both. I mean, we have a lot of music in this show, and a lot of it can be very big and motific, and some of it can also be sort of background fabric to really just help sort of buoy the scene.
Yeah.
I feel like with TNG, they did in the background a lot because they had so many dang concerts in that show. It's like, well, Riker's going to play the sax. We can just, play something in the background.
Trombone.
Yeah. Oh, trombone. There you go.
Trombone.
No, that was Harry.
Yeah, Harry. Sorry, darn it. I'm watching Voyager right now. I'm
Harry
messed up.
Harry played this stuff. Wow. Let's go deep, people.
We try.
So
one of the unique things about Discovery is that it's the first Star Trek series that is fully serialized instead of the episodic Trek from the 90s and obviously TOS. What were some of the challenges having to come up with the different themes for season 1's Klingon War Mirror Universe arc and season 2's Red Angel arc that certainly had a lot of religious overtones?
You know, I would say that I live in that kind of serialized narrative. I think that one of the things that attracted me most to really wanting to work in this world is because they were doing it in this way, where there was going to be more of an overarching narrative for a season with smaller individual. I know my hands are still going away.
No, that's good.
Okay.
where there was an overarching narrative, a story to be told across an entire season, and then little mini stories to go along the way, was very interesting to me. And I sort of do that a lot in some of the other projects that I work on, because it gives me an opportunity to write on a much broader scale. It gives me the opportunity to write a theme that I can refer to over and over again, which is, it makes the narrative storytelling very effective. Like, I can pull the audience into a moment and then connect that moment to something 4 episodes later. And subconsciously that sort of comes up, and you sort of know that Red Angel theme, I went back to many, many times in season 2, and because of how important it was. And it started small in episode, I think it was episode 2 or 3, when I remember which one it was, when they were in the church and you see the Red Angel for the first time. That was when that happened. Mm-hmm. And then I went back to that theme many, many times. And also with the also with the sphere theme, I have this sphere theme that I came up with, and that would come back over and over and over again, even when the sphere wasn't even being referenced directly, but there was sort of a thematic thing where what was happening was directly due to the sphere, and they weren't even talking about it, and it was happening, and I sort of knew that. I'd read a script, and I could bring little things in like that, and I like doing that. And that was the reason why in the opening of Picard, at the end of Picard, I gave a big nod to the original Romulan theme.
Yes.
Fred Steiner's original Romulan theme, because how great is it that I could tie that to this? And it really made sense to me. And I love that kind of stuff. I love Easter eggs like that. And I love being able to do that with my own themes, or with and Alexander Courage's themes, or Jerry Goldsmith's themes. It's so much fun for me. And I really feel like it ties it really binds the fabric of the entire universe. And so I to go back to your original question, like I feel like that's the thing that really makes it so interesting to me, is that I don't think of it as 13 individual episodes that need like a different melodic score every time. Like, yes, I'm constantly needing to come up with as new characters are introduced and new things happen, but there's still this one big sort of overarching theme that ties everything together, and that to me makes it great storytelling. It really makes it sort of much broader and bigger to me. So
and that's one of the things I really appreciate about like you called them Easter eggs, when you go back to certain themes from previous shows, because you use them so sparingly that when you do hear them, it just makes them that much more special, if that makes sense.
Sure. I mean, I have a saying in everybody in the studio, and most composers will say this. The same thing holds true to how much music you use. You're only as important as the silence that precedes it. And it's the same thing. If I were to use the Courage theme over and over and over and over and over again, it would get old. And it would be, so yeah, we try to choose those places very, very, very carefully, because when I use it, I want it to be really, really meaningful and really impactful.
Yeah.
You know,
That's
for me, it
obviously
was that moment when I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but that moment when you saw Picard in episode 4 on the bridge, and he says "engage" for the very first time, and it was the first time that I was like, I gotta play the Next Generation theme. And I did, and literally, like, you know, again, I come at this job as a huge fan, so when I sat back after writing that and playing that and heard that, literally a tear came to my eye, because all of a sudden I was 16 again or 17 again, and I was watching it, you know, when I was a kid. So it's such a thrill for me to be able to do that. And when I use it in the right places at the right time, it really does, you know, make it emotionally impactful for me. And I really do believe music of any storytelling in that way.
I'm sure a lot of people cried. Sorry, Brittany.
I was going to say that's the perfect segue, because I'm about to ask you about something that, you know, we cry so much watching Discovery, and the fact that you felt that way about, you know, Picard finally being back in his role again. We're going to talk about an episode that's near and dear to our hearts. So you're in a unique position, obviously, now that Discovery is no longer a prequel. So you get to play around a whole lot more in this new universe, and you make the show kind of fully your own. From what we've heard already, now that we're 5 episodes in, we have to say, of course, that the score for Forget Me Not is some of our favorite Trek music ever. Oh. It's up there as like probably my favorite Star Trek episode ever. So thank you for that. And we want to know, how has that experience been, especially since we know you've had to put everything together in a different way due to COVID.
Yeah. I mean, it's been, you know, when I started writing the first episode of this season, it was right around the time that that COVID was hitting, and you know, it was right at the beginning, so we didn't know what we were going to be able to do. I didn't know how we were going to record the orchestra. I didn't know if I was going to have to change the way I was writing to sort of fit how I was going to have to record it. And you know, I sat down with my engineer, I sat down with my coordinator, I sat down with Alex Kurtzman. I said, you know, and I say sat down, I mean, we were all on Zooms because at this point we weren't talking, weren't sitting in the same room together, but we talked a lot about how we were going to put together a score that was worthy, you know, worthy of Trek. And Alex actually called me after this conversation, and he said, he basically said, I trust you. One thing, please do not give me a synth score. I do not want a synth score. And I was like, in a million years, I'm never going to do that for this. Like, this is not that. We know what this needs to be. We know the emotional breadth of this season. We know how important the music plays, what the role that music plays in our version of Trek, right? So then we really had to figure out, like, how are we going to put this all together? And where we ended was, we ended up recording, you know, the entire orchestra individually in their own homes, and then combining them to make one big orchestra. Wow. And, you know, what I will say is, you know, it strained everybody. I mean, no one has slept in months, because what would normally take, you know, the writing didn't really change. I didn't want to change how I was going to go about writing, so that didn't really change. But what would normally take about 11 days from the time that I am done writing and done fixing, you know, based on notes and stuff from the producers and directors and stuff, take about 11 days to get it orchestrated, printed, recorded, and mixed, and then put into the show. That's about a 9 to 11 day process. It really depends on how much music there is in an episode. So that went from 9 to 11 days to almost 35 days. Wow. And we were overlapping that. We knew that we had to overlap. So it was like something that would normally take about 5 person hours was now taking 80 person hours, because each individual instrument had to be matched with counterparts and then sort of worked together, edited together, and then it has to be made to sound like they were actually playing in the same room. And we're talking about like 35 different people recording with different microphones in different rooms, with sometimes with a cat meowing in the background, sometimes with a car horn going on in the background, dogs barking, babies crying. Like you'd be surprised. Well, your 8-year-old kid walks in on you. Hey, Mom, I want breakfast. It's interesting. And all of the musicians had to go from just being musicians to all of a sudden being recording engineers and editors, because they had to record and edit, and like we had to. So we put together a dossier of basically like, this is what you need to do. This is how we need our file naming, our editing, and this and that, and this is what you need to do in order to give it to us so we can put it all together. So it was a pretty monumental task. And it wasn't until, I say recently, because I'm deliberately not telling anybody when I switched from recording remotely to back recording with at least a partial orchestra. I will say that we're still recording winds and brass at home, because we feel that it's not responsible putting people who are blowing in things and spitting everywhere. And because that's, at the end of a brass session, you usually have a big pile of spit on the floor.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're not putting them in the room, but we're doing strings now. We're back in the room with strings. And that's a big deal, because that's the biggest part of the orchestra. So it takes the most time to do. So I'm not really telling people when we made the switch, because I'd like people to sort of never know.
Well, and that's one thing I want to say to you. Absolutely, just complete props to you and your team, because listening to these first 5 episodes, none of us would have ever known whether that was the case anyway. So, congratulations on just an amazing job so far.
And we'd tell you too, because you're doing a whole podcast about Star Trek.
Yeah.
So.
I know. And the thing about it is, like, of course we were going to do whatever it took to get it to be right. And it's very important to me. It's very important to my whole team. Like we want this to be, what we wanted nobody to know. We wanted it to just be like, oh, we just did the score. Yeah, it's fine. Yeah. It's exactly as it should have been. And yeah, it was just a lot harder. COVID and this whole lockdown has changed the way we've had to do things. Yeah. In general. So
Jeff, I wasn't planning on asking you this question because it didn't come up until I watched today's episode of Discovery, but
today's episode is Die Trying, right?
Yes, it is. Yeah. Not that it isn't for every episode, but music definitely seems like it's going to play a major theme during the course of this season, with this song that some of these characters all seem to know, and they kind of, I guess they shouldn't know. Obviously, we don't want to ask you for any plot details. That wouldn't be right. But how has it been for you coming up with a piece of music that is going to be one of the big, main mysteries of the season, and having that be a plot point?
Well, interestingly, before I even started writing episode 1, Michelle Paradise called me and said, we've got this plot point. And I hadn't read all the scripts yet, so I didn't know what was happening in episode 7, 9, 11, like down the line. I had only read the first 2 scripts by that point. So she explained to me the issue of these 2 characters. And she said, this is something we need. This is something we need for you to take care of now, so we can know what's happening as this plot develops. So I wrote the cello melody that you hear playing, and that sort of, that becomes a part of the fabric of what's happening. And I did that early on. I did that before I started writing the score, because I wanted to know. Yeah, I didn't know how the narrative is going to develop. And I because I sort of look at this as I do my work on Star Trek in two ways. One way is I have a job and I've got to do this job, but I'm also such a fan that I want to be able to remove myself from it and experience it as a fan would. I think that helps me. It helps me get my creative hat on and really and sort of decide how I'm gonna want to do things. So once I get past the first few episodes, I stop reading scripts and I start experiencing it when they send me cuts. So as we get later into the season, the reason why I wanted to write that early on was so when I experienced that later in the episodes, and in episode 5 is when that first started happening, I would understand then, oh, okay, I got to put this, now I understand how this is going to go here and how I'm going to have to work this in. And that's going to sort of continue through the episodes.
I love it because you have narrative strings that turn into narrative threads. It's
Right.
all very symbolic. I love it.
So I wanted to ask about the title, because I mean it's really set the tone for the series in the way that it always does, right? And how was that creating the title sequence, the sound? And you know, you want it to sound like Star Trek, but you don't want it to sound like any other Star Trek. What was that like?
Well, with Discovery, you know, first of all, when I was asked to write the theme for Discovery, I mean, that was one of the more incredibly terrifying phone calls I'd ever had. And the reason why that is because, you know, it's one thing to think about creating the music for an episode, but it's another thing to sort of create the signature of a show. And it's, you know, and then there's one thing doing it show that nobody knows yet. And then there's another thing when you're asked to do that for something that has so much history, and then not only history, but literally the masters of the craft have done this, have been the people to write the previous themes, like the best of the best. You know, Alexander Courage is among some of the, at the top of the composer lists, game, whatever you want to call it. And obviously, you know, Jerry Goldsmith as well. So that was sort of terrifying to begin with. And then I sort of, after you get over that terror, you think about like, well, okay, how do I write something that is meaningful to the franchise, meaningful to the series, and then and connected to it, and then also has its own identity. You know, one of the things Alex and I talked about a lot with Discovery in the first season was to be connected and yet be modern and forward looking. Like we didn't want to be just a, you know, rehash of something that had already happened. We didn't want to be, you know, we weren't doing a remake. You know, we were the next step in Star Trek. This is the step moving forward. And a lot of times that can be hard for fans. It can be hard to digest that, where you get so used to something that when something new comes along inside of that, you're like, whoa, wow, don't do that. Do that other thing that we know and love. So it's a really delicate thread. I'm conflating all of these different sayings. It's a hard needle to thread, and it's really delicate. So trying to push forward and yet still connect to the beginning and still connect to where we were. And, you know, I think a lot of Star Trek does that. You know, Star Trek does have a beginning and a middle. And there isn't an end, obviously, because we continue moving forward, but we do have these iconic moments in the history of Trek, and we don't want to forget them, but we do want to continue to move forward. So in doing that, like, there are modern techniques that I wanted to sort of impart on the score, and there were classic techniques that I wanted to, which is, you know, horns and a big fanfare, and then there's cello ostinato, which is a little more of a modern take on things, and there's a little more modern percussion going on in it. Wanting to feel like there's a melody there is memorable and yet also sits inside of the fabric of Star Trek. So not being overtly trying to be too memorable or too much of a thing, you know, because you don't want to be looked at as somebody who's trying too hard. You know, it was just, it's really a mishmash of a lot of different feelings. But generally speaking, it was terrifying to think that I was, you know, standing in the shadow of these giants and to be spoken about in the same breath as those people. It's pretty thrilling and incredible.
Of course.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Real quick, I just wanted to ask, what's your favorite theme other than your own?
Well, I wouldn't put mine in the top of my favorite themes. I would say it's interesting, you know, from a thematic point of view, the original series is so iconic that it's hard to not have that be the thing that is, you know, but melodically, and I don't know how this is going to go over, but melodically Voyager
That's my favorite.
Melodically Voyager is really pulls on those heartstrings for me, really does. And it's interesting because I didn't get that much into the show. I watched the show. I wasn't as into Voyager as I was to the previous incarnations. And that may have just been of where I was in my life at the time, you know, like what was happening just generally speaking. But that in getting to study all of these scores, that particular one is pretty intense. Of all of the main title themes for all of the television shows, because there are themes that I love from the movies that are not like main title themes that I love as well.
No, I think honestly, I would put your theme up near the top of mine, because not only does it touch upon all these like Star Trek styles and instrumentations, but you get the sense that it's also telling the story of Discovery and of Starfleet itself. Could you talk us through how you use like dissonance versus harmony to tell the story of Discovery through the theme?
Through the theme, well, you know, the way the whole thing opens is as an homage to the opening of the original, which is there's this glockenspiel, and then there's a little bit of sort of sound design that happens and a little bit of melody that happens. You know, the dissonance that you hear is more as we get later in the theme, as it grows bigger and bigger and bigger. The dissonance happens when you are crossing from what is the theme that I was writing to Alexander Courage's theme. And to me, because I was originally thinking of this as we were coming into it from behind the original series, you know, as something that happens prior to the original series. Like, wouldn't it be nice for there to be some cognitive dissonance in the theme leading into that? You know, one of the things that was really interesting to me when looking at the main titles was, as Gene Roddenberry's name comes up, that's when I thought, oh, okay, don't we really want to sort of tip our hat right there? Mm-hmm. So leading up to that felt like dissonance was kind of an interesting idea to try to have a little bit of dissonance and then a big sort of release as we see, you know, our world's creator, so to speak. And I say that without any religious overtones whatsoever, but just the fact that, you know, that Star Trek is his brainchild, and I thought it would be a nice sort of way to, you know, ease our way into a new world. I
want to pick up where we left off with Disco and talking about title themes. Was there any pressure making sure that you came up with a title for Picard that is, you know, who's maybe one of the most adored characters in Star Trek history? That's got to be no easy task coming from, you know, Jerry Goldsmith's motion picture theme, and then later, obviously, TNG theme.
Yeah. I mean, you know, it was one thing to be asked to write the theme for Discovery. But when I was talking with Alex and Michael about Picard, I was truly terrified with writing the Picard theme. I was terrified to the point where, I mean, you can ask my wife this, although I don't know how you would ask her, but you could. And if you could ask her, she would say that I was obsessed. I was literally, so last summer, summer 2019, when I was writing it, I would walk around the house, and I would sit at the piano and play, and then I'd walk, and then I'd play, and I'd play the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over again. And then I'd walk around the house, and I mean, it was crazy. It was crazy. I was befuddled. I was terrified and befuddled. And, you know, it's because I have such a history with watching The Next Generation. It was a pretty incredible thing. So this particular character actually had an effect on me, you know, personally, like a personal effect on me, because I grew up watching The Next Generation. And, you know, Sir Patrick Stewart's performance as Captain Jean-Luc Picard is really, really, really incredible, and had a big impact on me. So when I was sort of into writing that, it was really interesting. But it was one of those things where I had an idea, and that idea never went away. The idea that I had, my first idea that I had when I sat down at the piano, it made it through every iteration in my mind, and every iteration that ended up going, like, getting written and then changed, and then and it was a testament to my feeling about the show and the character, and having that one spark of an idea, and then always going back to that. Always going back to it, because it was the first thing that really connected. It felt like my connection to the character. But it was a difficult emotional mountain to climb. It wasn't terribly difficult to write. It wasn't terribly difficult to create, but I had an emotional mountain that I had to climb to get there, because of how connected I have been to the character and to that original series, and the original theme, which is so iconic. You know, that it was like, how do you live up to that? It's, you know, one of the things that I struggle with is, how do I live up to some of these you know, some of these incredible pieces of music written by these, you know, composers that are, you know, in the Hall of Fame of composers, if there was one.
I assume that doesn't happen often, where you just have something that comes to you and like that's it.
Well, sometimes that happens, you know. When working in television, you don't really have a lot of time to sort of mull things over. So that's why I try to do and write as much prior to getting into full-scale production as possible, because there's simply not a lot of time to sort of rethink things. You know, the good news with main titles and that kind of thing is, I do have a lot longer to figure it out, because I get a call and they say, okay, you know, we're going to need this in like 4 months. What do you think? And, you know, and then I can start sort of sketching things out. But, you know, on an episodic level, you know, we spot an episode, and if the theme isn't already written, I got to write something pretty quick.
I know when I talk to friends about Star Trek music, they usually think about the use of horns, that the ba 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 ba, which is very prevalent in the films and the 90s shows. But with Picard and Discovery, there's this sense of romance, or this romantic adventure feel, through the prominent use of strings, especially the use of my favorite instrument, the cello. So how did this stylistic change come to be? And was it in part because of the more serious tone of the writing?
Well, you know, one of the things I originally pitched was the idea of wanting to have it be a more emotionally connected score. One of the things that I think I really connected with is how the characters engage with each other. And that to me was important to really manifest in music. You know, the swashbuckling thing was sort of a foregone conclusion. I knew that I was going to have horn things and the action moments, but the important parts that I didn't think had come before were an emotional connectivity from a musical perspective. And, you know, cello to me is my go-to emotional instrument. And one of the reasons for that is cello lives in the frequency spectrum, the same frequency spectrum that the human voice lives. So when you hear a cello, you hear it in that same way that you hear someone speaking or singing. And that to me really is human. And I know that there are many species in our universe. I can only speak as the species that I am. So I do that, and hopefully that translates universally. And I think it does. You know, I think that from a melodic standpoint, it does sort of translate on a bigger scale. But that was the reason why I did that. I wanted to choose to do that, to sort of have more of an emotional connection to characters.
In a previous interview, you were on Ready Room with Will Wheaton, and you mentioned the importance of being very careful with how much you use some of the familiar Trek themes, and I know we've already talked about that a bit. Mm-hmm. But whether it's the Starfleet horns used at the end of People of Earth, or the TNG motion picture theme, The End is the Beginning, when La Sirena goes to warp, is this decision something that comes down from the production team? Like, do they have an idea in mind, or is it a choice that you've made to make sure those specific themes stay special?
Well, so it's a little bit of both. Sometimes I get a call from Alex or from Michelle saying, hey, wouldn't it be really nice if right here we use the TOS theme? 9 times out of 10, I make that decision. And I say I make that decision and then await approval of that decision from on high. Mm-hmm. But 9 times out of 10, we've gotten to the point now where I know where it needs to go. I know where we want to use it. There hasn't really been a moment where it was in a place that it shouldn't have gone, and I was like, maybe we shouldn't do that there. We're also at the point now where the editors are temping the scores with my previous scores, so they will use little things like that and be like, oh, put the TOS theme here, and a lot of times that'll work. But we really do try to utilize it only when absolutely necessary. So when it's used, it has a much, much greater impact.
So was Picard more of a challenge than Discovery because of the whole era of TNG music, style of music in the 90s with like The Next Generation, DS9, and Voyager? Or did you look at it as something you were completely starting from scratch?
Yeah, I didn't look to the older series as a blueprint for it, because it's a story that hadn't been told. It's Picard's story. It's the story of him as a human, him as an individual, as opposed to the story of the Enterprise with him at its helm, which is a different take on a Star Trek story that it had never been done. Like in Star, that was never a way the story was ever told. So I felt like we had a little more leeway there to decide to do a different type of score, to have it be smaller, to have it be more personal. I used a lot more individual solo instruments, flute and various shakuhachi flute and cello and violin and other individual instruments that could be more intimate. It's an intimate telling, and yeah, there were these big moments, but we had an opportunity to sort of change the way the musical narrative was. And that, I think, made it easier. I think that may have made it easier because it felt like I didn't really have to follow an architectural blueprint. I really had a little more creative freedom.
I think what's wonderful about that too is that it's so special. I think I've already said this about some of the other music you've done, but it's so special when you do hear those themes that we're familiar with in Picard, because they are used just so sparingly. So the score for Picard is just so unique on its own. It's really beautiful. So
I appreciate that.
Jeff, we want to say thank you so much for coming on our pod. It has been an honor and a privilege to have you. Any projects besides Discovery that you're working on that you'd like to share with us and tell folks where they can find you?
Well, so Fargo is out now, and that is something that I'm extremely proud of. The scores for Fargo have been something that's been very near and dear to my heart, and I would say that, and the Umbrella Academy is something that is also very near and dear to my heart. A lot of fun working on that one.
I love Umbrella Academy.
It's a lot of fun. That show is a lot of fun.
I love Fargo.
Both of those shows. That's the thing. I'm extremely fortunate, extremely lucky that I get to work on these projects that are so much fun for me to do, and they have so much in the way of giving back to me artistically. So I would say that those are the things that are going on right now.
Great.
You want to check anything else out?
Thanks for beaming into our podcast today. If you want to keep the Hailing Frequencies open, you can subscribe on Apple and Google Podcasts, YouTube, and Spotify. Like what you hear? Put in a good word with Starfleet and leave us a 5-star review.